the rule of three. And the rule of three is how you convert a two-handed rod, whether it's switch or spey, mentally to a one-handed rod. And the rule of three basically means you add the number 3 to the rod size. This is a 4-weight switch rod, so it's about what a 7-weight one-handed rod is in terms of power, in terms of load, in terms of battling a fish. That's a good tip to have. Still, in an awful lot of places I travel, I see somebody with a beautiful 4-weight switch rod and then they put on a 4-weight trout line and wonder why the heck the thing doesn't work. 4 on a 4 sounds like it should work. Sadly, there's 2 systems, there's 2 standards, they don't match, and so you just got to know that rule of 3. That is about a 7-weight one-handed rod. Just FYI. So a 7-weight one-handed rod takes around 250 grains. That's a nice load for a 7-weight. This is a 275 grain Scandi, so you can kind of see where that relationship is. The other rule of thumb I like to use on switch rods is that it's going to be easier for you folks because you work on kilograms, but you know, in America we still work on pounds over there, and you double the rod size for the fish size. So a 4-weight is a great stick for fish up to about 7-8 pounds. It's great for trout, it's great for small summer on steelhead, sea run browns up to 6, 7, 8 pounds. Of course you can land a fish on it that would be 10, 12 pounds, 15 pounds, but it wouldn't be the rod choice if you're targeting fish that size. That's why it's my favorite rod, because I do a lot of trout fishing with this thing in Montana and Idaho, and I just love fishing those 18, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20-inch trout with a little lightweight tool like this. It's not an overkill. So a couple of good ways of thinking about that. If you're ever thinking about going to buy a switch rod, use those 2 rules, guidelines if you like, on how to choose the next outfit that's going to be applicable and fun. The whole thing should be fun. Any questions on that at this early stage? All right. Next step, always find out where the rod balance is. There's a couple of little nuggets. I'm going to throw out a few things. 1 or 2 of them you should not forget. 1 you should not forget. 1 or 2 you should not forget. And one of the most important ones is this. Find out where this balance is. The whole game of casting, whether you're casting overhead or spey, one hand or 2 hand, is to be as effortless and as beautiful as you possibly can be. You don't want to be the flailing hacker that everybody walks away from. And so when you find the balance point of your rod, you grip it with your hands. I won't grip it for a second. You see how little movement it takes to move the rod where you want to. Right? It doesn't take anything. That bottom hand can move that rod so easily. If you don't hold the gravity point, all the time you're fighting it. When I'm fishing one of these things, you know, I like to fish the swing, so I'm throwing my line out, and I just drop the rod into my hand, I hold the balance, it swings, it's relaxed, I'm tired, I'm tense. You can do that by holding this balance. So switch rods, it's pretty easy because the rods are short levers, there's not a lot of weight. When you get to big rods like 14 and 15 and 16 foot rods, there's a lot more graphite that end. They become top heavy and you need a much heavier counterbalance this end to get the balance point in your hand. But do so, because even though you're adding weight to the entire kit setup, somebody once wrote, some physicist, philosopher, somebody once wrote, give me a long enough lever and I could lift the world. It's all about the length of leverage. If you get the fulcrum right, you can lift anything, move anything. So don't buy a nice long 16-foot salmon rod and get the lightest reel on there thinking, I'm going to keep this overall weight down, because you will be so tired because your balance point's going to be somewhere up here. So balance is a critical factor. This one's perfectly balanced, and obviously because it's my go-to fishing kit. So that's a little tiny bit about rods. Two-handed.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but would that philosophy of balance apply to a single-handed rod?
Yeah. If you want to get your perfect balance and turning movement here, yeah, of course you want to hold the balance. Otherwise, you're turning over a hammer. Or a heavier hammer, a longer lever. So yeah, totally. For rotational, totally. Not for drive, but for rotation. Okay, so let's just look at a roll cast. I know we haven't got a lot of time here, and I do apologise. I have an absolute massive amount of information I could tell you and bore the pants off you and talk for 3 hours on Spey. I love Spey. It's my huge passion. And so I get a little carried away, and I'm going to get the yellow flag saying, please stop. So, I'll try and temper it by being the raw essentials. And then beyond that, if you want to go beyond the raw essentials, I'm very, very happy to take those of you who are crazy enough to want to know more advanced stuff down there, and we'll do something different. So let's look at the very, very basic essentials of what a cast is. As I said, it comes from the roll cast, so the first thing is to master a good roll cast. And there's a couple of things on mastering a good roll cast that I'd like to stress. One of them is to develop a really good forward stroke. Every Spey cast you make is going to finish with a forward stroke, obviously. So let's get a good one. If you can get a good forward stroke, then you can apply that to any Spey cast, where you make a double, single, snap, snake, oozlem, jelly, wombat, whatever they are. So one of the early exercises is to develop this very good forward stroke. And if you're a proud one-handed fly caster, and you phone me up and say, Simon, I'd like to learn to Spey cast, and I've fished for trout for 50 years, that's a problem. Really? And you're excited by that? Okay. Because there's a muscle memory, and one of the hardest things to overcome is, if you've overhead cast one-handed all your life, the instinct to give a little acceleration is going to be mind-numbingly hard to overcome. More people, more beginners will learn way quicker with a non-dominant hand, because there is no urge to pop. So bear that in mind if you do find yourself popping. So a roll cast, well, let's just kind of run very quickly through the terminology. This thing hanging down from my rod tip's called a D-loop. So it loads the rod. D-loop's everything. The D-loop's absolutely everything in terms of how effortless or how much force you apply as a caster. The D-loop was what makes the rod bend. You must have a D-loop. So as you drag the line back, you want to watch the line hanging here. There's a bit of wind blowing the line in front of the rod. There's no line behind the rod here. I'm going to tilt this rod back, tilt it back, tilt it back. Make sure there's a little bit of weight to load the rod. It's particularly useful to know when you've got strong winds. If any of you are going to Lago Strobel, to Argentina, you're going to find some winds. And some of those winds might be behind you, and your D-loop's constantly out here being blown by these strong winds, and you try to make these casts, the rod doesn't load. So do anything to create some kind of D-loop, something that's going to make your rod load. And the physics of everything are very, very simple. That is a loaded rod. That's not a loaded rod. A loaded rod isn't going to cast a millimeter on its own. Just does that. Sorry, an unloaded rod. A loaded rod, oh yeah, boing, the rod has a flex. The flex is your friend, the flex is going to unload, get your line out there. And so, when you're trying to make a cast, you're trying to load the rod from, in this case, the D-loop. The forward stroke of a good casting stroke enhances this load. So, imagine the rod in this kind of angle here. When you drive the rod forward, the rod's going to bend backwards against the line. Now, you can do a couple of things. Again, and I haven't seen you cast well enough to know, so I apologise if I say, oh, this is what you're going to be doing, and none of you do this because you're all great. But a lot of people, sadly, when they pick up the two-handed rod for the first time, this hand stays right there. The top hand does everything. What you'll notice, what's wrong with this, is that the rod rotates at the very start of the casting stroke. What should happen, even on an overhead cast with a one-handed rod or anything, the rod should load. So in slow motion, I kind of turn this way, in slow motion, a good forward casting stroke is going to do something like this. Then turn. The turn is the very last part of the stroke, the rotation. Hard to do. I say if you don't have that muscle memory developed, you'll probably turn as you go forward, and then when you decide to put some power in, the rod tips in front, the power goes down, the loop opens up into a circular shape that's big enough to drive a bus through, line lands in a heap, you break the rod, pick up a golf stick and go golfing. Terrible. So, one of the early exercises is developing this loading movement, keeps the rod pinned back.